Hello, I'm Simona Manni, and I'm here to present the paper Designing Structural Participation in an Interactive Film on Mental Health, which has been part of my PhD research taking place at the Digital Creativity Labs, University of York. In this research, we have started from the perspective of participatory filmmaking, a practice where professional filmmakers pass on skills to community members, especially from underrepresented groups, acting as facilitators. Through this practice, community members can produce their own media pieces that are centered around issues close to the lived experience. Participatory filmmaking is centered around the values of voice, dialogue, transformation, encounter, trust, and co-production, and it's about empowering communities, especially when they're stigmatized and marginalized, to take ownership of representations about themselves. In mental health, this is a practice that can be very fruitful to counteract stigma, and this helps creating new representations of mental illness that are free from stereotypes that are often endorsed in mainstream media. This research is centered around my practice as a participatory filmmaker, so I've been a participatory filmmaker for around 10 years, working with communities to produce participatory accounts of mental health, mental illness, and recovery. In this study, we looked at merging the practice of participatory filmmaking with interactive documentary. In fact, interactive documentaries, or iDocs, that are films where the audience can choose which materials they're going to watch, in which order, or they adapt to certain data about the audience, have been praised for their participatory potential. This is because, thanks to narrative non-linearity afforded by interactive media, interactive documentaries can allow for more storylines to coexist, for the audience to insert their own input in the film and even add materials that are not necessarily filmic form, so for instance images, still images, sound and text. iDocs can be responsive, can adapt to the data or the condition of the audience who's watching. They are often praised for being able to increase empathy and having immersive qualities, often putting the audience in the shoes of certain characters. All of these qualities make interactive documentary possibly even more suitable for participation than traditional film. However, the participatory potential in interactive documentary depends on how participation is designed. Nash has divided participation in interactive documentary as minimalist and maximalist. And taking also into account literal theories, we can see the minimalist or executory participation is the most common in interactive documentaries. And it's when there is a structure that has been created by professional designers, and then there is space for the audience to input content. But the audience is not really able to be an author, in the sense that is not able to influence the structure of the documentary. Maximalist or structural participation, which is a lot more uncommon, means that there is equality in decision making between professionals and non-professionals, and participants are able to inform the entire structure of the documentary, not just the content that populates it. Our study has been about how can we make a participatory iDoc which is structurally participatory. And this is because in the practice of participatory filmmaking in mental health, is of paramount importance that participants can author the entire film. And in the case of interactive documentary, this means both the structure and the content. In order to do this, we used an existing film as a case study. This film is called Stepping Through, and it's a film that was made in 2016 with 5 men with experience of mental illness about isolation and recovery. It's a film that was co-produced and included many different perspectives. In my PhD, there was a preliminary study which looked at the limits of Stepping Through as a linear film, and through a deconstruction that took place with participants showed that there were several expressive needs that were not fully accommodated by the film being linear. And making the film non-linear, that is interactive, could have made space for more storylines, more perspectives, and more complexity in the representation. So from this preliminary study, we moved into the second study, the one that we are talking about in this presentation, where participants created a design for an interactive version of Stepping Through, taking part in 40 co-production workshops between October 2018 and February 2020. The result was Stepping Through Interactive, a non-linear film where participants created a structure which is based around encouraging empathy building and self-reflection in audiences, which were the main authorial aims for this group of participants. In this presentation and in this paper, we're not talking about the film itself and its qualities, but rather the process that got us there. So how did we create a structurally participatory process that allowed the creation of a film that was completely authored by the participants? This is a reflective study when we looked back at a very long process and we identified principles that were in place that allowed the process to be structurally participatory. The first principle is circularity and adaptability of the process. What we did was creating a process that was very flexible and responsive to the needs of participants. The process that we used to make this interactive documentary was based on the participatory film process that participants already knew, which saw an alternation of phases, which is quite linear, of brainstorming ideas, creating sound, imagery, filming, and then an editorial part, which was usually curated by a filmmaker, such as myself, which would put together the footage created by the participants according to their authorial intentions, and then would check if the film was respectful of participants' intentions, and would then repeat this process of editing and checking until a satisfactory final product would be identified. In this case, we had to make the process a lot more circular. We started with an initial writing, sound recording, and brainstorming of imagery phase, but then we went into an alternation of organizing and planning the filming, having filming sessions, reviewing the video editing, reflecting on what interactive design would be the most appropriate for the filming that we were doing, and repeating these sets of workshops as many times as needed, instead of thinking that we could go straight from organizing and filming to creating an interactive narrative and then technical implementation. We needed many iterations of these cycles before we could move into the technical implementation. This was for different reasons, because we didn't want to overwhelm participants by having the same activities repeated too often, and also because we were exploring a structure that was completely designed by participants and their authorial and expressive needs. So we didn't know what the structure would be until we started to make it. And for this reason, we needed to double check several times. Also, this type of filming requires a lot more footage than traditional filming, and so we needed to go back and analyze the filming that we had and what footage was necessary according to how the interactive structure was developing. Another principle was to focus on expressive needs over form. So we didn't try to imitate an existing IDOC, but we rather tried to imagine a new form, and this form was based on the expressive needs of participants. So the process started with quite a long phase where we analyzed and discussed with participants what they wanted to express and what kind of narrative materials they wanted into the film before even starting to think about the interactive structure. Only when the expressive needs of participants were very clear, we then moved into looking at different IDOCs to find inspiration, and participants eventually designed their own interactive structure. The third principle was to create tangibility in the design process. Both myself and the participants were not experienced at all in interactive media production. It was our first experience. And as such, it would have been too complicated to start working with software straight away. What we did instead, inspired also by boundary objects in design, was to use paper-based methods to basically deconstruct the original film and add different aspects of other narrative materials that were represented by cards, by strips of black and white paper, and by color tape that represented the connection amongst materials. The structure was then turned into a digital structure and eventually became the film itself. Principle 4 is to find a balance between process and final product. In participatory filmmaking, the process is often more important than the final product, because it's during the process that the empowering effect of participatory filmmaking takes place. Here we had to find a balance. We had to look at the final product and make sure that it was as satisfactory as possible for our participants and that it would support their expressive needs, but also making the process as enjoyable and inclusive as possible so that the process in itself would be valuable for our participants. Another principle was around acquiring new skills. In participatory filmmaking, a professional filmmaker passes on skills to unprofessional participants who have usually never been filmmakers before. And by taking part in the process, they acquire new skills. In the design of an interactive documentary, this becomes more complicated because there is an extra layer of necessary skills in interaction design and also implementation that often the filmmakers themselves, such as in my case, don't have and are not able to pass on to participants. In order to create this documentary, we had to work with a technical team, which is co-author of this paper. And the technical team was working with Cutting Room, a sophisticated tool which is being produced by my university, the University of York. While this tool is quite accessible compared to other interactive design tools, it's still not user-friendly for a lay filmmaker and for the participants in this case either. So what we did was trying to create prototypes on paper, but also prototypes using a more accessible software such as Clint. Clint wouldn't have been able to support the full implementation of the film that we were creating, but it was really useful to create partial prototypes and mini features demos that I could use to help participants express their wishes to the technical team and for the technical team to then communicate what was possible or not possible to participants. So it was a mixture of creating new partnership, but also using a variety of tools according to what we wanted to achieve. These are the 5 principles we implemented to ensure that the film that we were creating was structurally participatory and that the process itself was inclusive and mindful of participant needs. Of course, in the paper, there is a lot more detail about recommendation for other community projects that want to try this approach. So starting from participatory filmmaking and then adding interactive documentary to the process that we hope will stimulate more research in this area. Stepping Through Interactive is available to the public and can be seen online. If you're interested in watching the film, please reach out to me at simona.manni@york.ac.uk.